Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Big Purple Blob. Today, this is Susie Brown. I am here today talking with an old friend, and we are talking about this is a conversation that needs to start rolling, needs to happen, and hopefully we can start this ball rolling. My guest today is Dr. Tanisha Taylor. She is an educator of 22 years in the US and international school system. She is super smart, but I'll let her prove that to you herself. But she's a pioneer in this. She's been completing her studies and a pioneer in an area that is super important that we need to talk about. Tanisha, tell me about what we're going to be talking about today.
So I'm glad you said it was a super important topic we need to be talking about, specifically in international schools. And that topic is racism. And I know it's kind of been on everybody's radar, especially since 2020 with COVID and what they're calling now the racial reckoning of 2020, where sort of the world sat up and took notice of some issues of discrimination that maybe weren't necessarily on people's radars before. One of those industries is international schools, which my kids go to international schools, your kids go to international schools. And international schools sort of sat up and said, is there racism in international schools? And they sort of determined, yes, there is. The challenge for international schools, however, was that, they're housing multiple ethnicities and cultures and nationalities, and everyone comes with their own set of understandings. And how do they deal with this? So, through my own children's experiences, I'm an African American woman in these spaces where I started to understand there was a pattern globally, not just about racism and discrimination in terms of cultural differences, but there's a very clear through line for what's called anti-Black racism. And that there really is not a space where that's not occurring in American international schools. So I did my dissertation study on what that looks like for these families. What are they actually experiencing? I basically asked the question that no one's ever asked. What do Black kids experience in terms of racialized events in American international schools? I focused on the schools that are sponsored by the State Department because that's where we live and breathe in our community. And I had some really interesting results.
Okay, that is a big question, and that is an important topic. And I'm really glad that we're bringing this forward. So now you've been in multiple countries, and your kids have been in multiple international schools, and you've seen this across all of them. And your study focused on international schools as well as US schools.
Yes, it was a comparative study that I was like, is it the same what they're experiencing, if they're experiencing anything at all in international schools to what they experience in the States? Is it different? Is it non-existent? And so I also asked that question of basically sort of trying to figure out, are Black kids better off overseas or not in terms of racialized experiences?
And the answer?
The answer is it's pretty much the same,
That
unfortunately.
surprises me.
Surprised me too, actually. um, I guess if you want to call it a hypothesis, my study was really what we call qualitative, where it's just about getting people's stories. But I sort of was thinking, it's going to be completely different. They're not going to have the same racialized experiences, and that the American community was going to sort of band together from a national point of view, and sort of that's going to be the community because it's so small, and it was going to be sort of an uplifting experience. What I found was, unfortunately, was that students experienced depth of microaggressions from inside the American community as well as host country as well as expats, pretty much all around. Perceptions of being inferior, physical and psychological violence at the hands of teachers, students, and administrators. So it was just across the board. I think, which is exactly what the scholarship in the United States tells us. So it was almost a 1-to-1. The difference would be that it wasn't as often or as prevalent. So although there's a pattern of it, it wasn't an everyday occurrence for most students. It wasn't all the time, but it happened in every single child in my study and their parents' experience, no matter what part of the world they were in.
Mm, that's heartbreaking.
No, certainly. Some of the things that came out of the study was the use of the N-word. That was a big one. That was a big one, no matter what country, including countries on the continent of Africa. Whereas for the most part, the N-word is not an African word in terms of all the countries that are there. I'm not going to lump them together, but that's just not a word that's commonly used there. So that word would be used to describe American African Americans from people from the diaspora. Other students would use it. Another thing was students were sometimes hit, they were touched, their hair was touched, which I consider physical assault, pulled sometimes. Just all kinds of really horrific things came out of the study. And to make it personal, some of those same things happened to my own children.
Oh, well, I mean, it breaks my heart that children are experiencing this anywhere on the planet. But even I almost feel like in our bubble, in our international schools, how can that be a selected group? You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. So it kind of comes down to, and not, I don't want to get too much in the weeds, but it kind of comes down to the history of chattel slavery, which was centuries ago. It sort of put forth this narrative in the world of sort of Black inferiority. So chattel slavery was not a United States phenomenon. It was in South America, Canada, parts of Middle East. And then if you look in places like New Zealand or Australia, there have indigenous issues of colonization. Southeast Asia had issues of colonization. So this sort of all rippled out into what people call in the academic world the color line. And so it's sort of like Blackness on one end, whiteness on the other end, and everybody sort of is in between. And so what that does is it sort of puts the Black kids again at one end and not, on the business end, so to speak, of this color line. And so that's why it sort of permeates globally. And we don't talk about it. It's not in our history books, nobody learns about it. I certainly didn't learn about it until, grad school. So I'm not, the kids aren't aware of where these ideas come from, but they still put them forth. In all the places of the world that we've been, it is prevalent. The term is anti-Blackness, is what academics call it. So part of that in the international schools, as much as we have this multicultural student body, the education force, the teachers and the teacher leaders, administrators, are overwhelmingly from the global north or identify as white. Overwhelmingly. This is just in American international schools, but international schools at large. In China, in Tanzania, in Australia, in Brazil. 80% in a survey done by International School Services, 80% of teachers identified as white globally. And that number is higher for administrators. And so not pointing a finger at that, but there is no real understanding because there aren't people of color in that space who are teaching the children some of these issues in terms of racism and marginalization. There just is no understanding, is just, I think, the best way to put it.
So we know this now as a problem.
Yeah.
And So that lack of awareness is clearly part of the problem.
Absolutely.
So
So
how
what
do
do we
we
need?
work towards something that can help us? We may not be able to solve the problem, but there has to be a way to mitigate it or move past it and help our kids of whatever color they are have the school experience that they deserve.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you said whatever color they are. This doesn't just harm Black kids, it harms everybody. They're in these international school spaces where they're taught global citizenship and international mindedness, and yet they are students that are non-Black are witnessing the behaviors against Black students, and consciously or subconsciously, they get a message. So it harms them too. It puts them out in the world in a way that none of us really intend. So how do we mitigate it? Well, first of all, I'm going to urge parents of all races, Black and non-Black, and if you ever witness or even hear in passing of some anti-Black behavior with children, report it to the Office of Overseas Schools for our state-supported schools. They're working really hard to make this a child protection issue and a social emotional learning issue. They are heavily invested in both of those two terms. Child protection is just kids being safe, safe to be who they are, that they shouldn't be assaulted or abused in any way. And racial discrimination is at its core abuse. Social emotional learning, on the other hand, is teaching kids to not just regulate their own behaviors, but to understand who they are, who other people are, and to get along with one another, to find healthy ways to deal with conflict, so on and so forth, right? So we're really teaching kids in these spaces to be good humans, right? So the Office of Overseas Schools is, as I said, heavily invested in this. They have put forth some reports. You can go on their website. They have some reports you can download on social emotional learning and child protection. But they have yet to name racism as its own child protection issue. Rightfully so, they name sexual assault or things like that. I am urging them, and I'm putting a call that racial discrimination also fits in that category, along with some other marginalized groups that are experiencing the same thing. So call the Office of Overseas Schools, send them an email, say, I witnessed this happened to my child. And I want you to have sort of these statistics, this understanding that this is happening. I can tell you that there is no Black child in these spaces who has not either experienced this or witnessed it. It is extremely unlikely that you will find a child that has not been in that space. It is not a matter of if, but when. So, yeah, that would be the first thing. The second thing is, for the parents out there, it's important that you're attentive, that you deliberately look for these situations with your child, believe them when they tell you that something racial happened to them, even if it may seem a little subtle. Recognize that this can come from students, teachers, or administrators. Recognize that that the student needs to be heard and felt safe. And so I would tell parents to say, you have the agency to walk away from harm. You have the right to tell a teacher and then tell me and we'll deal with it. Parents also need to racialize their children in a positive way. Give them the history that we didn't give. The uplifting and the real history of people from the African diaspora and other parts of the world, people of color, the positive aspects of it, that it didn't start with slavery and that it didn't end with slavery either, that Black peoples in the world are doing wonderful things and they are strong members of the global community. It's important that they don't internalize racism, because that leads to deep depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation. All of that came out in my study. And again, my own vulnerability, my own children experience that. So parents have to be super aware of this racialization. Also, I would tell parents to seek therapy if their child's in a situation where they're being harmed and racially discriminated against. And try to find a therapist that deals with this issue because it is very specific. But if you can't, because we are overseas, some therapy is better than no therapy, as I always say. Yeah, I think those would be some of the advice that I would give to people listening out there.
And what would you say to do for kids to do, kids who are white or Asian or of whatever color? What do they do to help protect their friends that they might see going through these sorts of situations? Because a lot of times, at least in my experience with my kids, there are always anti-bully rules. There are always rules and regulations of the school that work. They are supposed to work to protect the kids. But then you have, reality where if you go and you rat out your buddy who was a jerk to this kid and continually is a jerk to this kid, then that can turn on to them. So how do we help that? I mean, because this really is something that becomes a systemic problem.
No, absolutely. That's a great question. I actually just was at my child's school yesterday talking about the exact same thing with kids, middle schoolers. And I hear you, having taught middle school and having middle school kids, it's not as simple as stand up and be an ally. It's not as simple as you're not doing the right thing because you're a bystander, because they don't have the capacity to do that, and they don't even know where the line is drawn. The students I talked to the other day were really confused about the use of the N-word in particular in songs, right? And that's a legitimate conversation that middle schoolers had with me. Well, how do I sing the song, or how do I hear it in this music, and then I'm not allowed to say it to my Black friend? Like, how do I square that circle? And so I would tell kids this. I would say, as best as you can, look at the intent. And that's not to say that racialized events aren't still going to harm Black students, but as a friend, as a bystander, look at the intent of the kid. If the kid is trying to sing along to a rap song, or is trying to understand some music or something and is using it inappropriately, that's a real quick way to say, yeah, that's a cool song, but maybe you shouldn't say it out loud, and kind of just drop it softly without, maybe there was no intent. And then tell the parent or a teacher, hey, this word was being used and, we were chatting about it. I want you to know my Black friend might be feeling sad about it or hurt, or maybe the parents need to know, and sort of shuffle it that way. If you know the intent is absolutely to be harmful and cruel, and we know when that happens, then help your friend. If you don't feel safe standing up for your friend, then just get them out of the situation. Walk with that person so they're not alone. Say, let's go, and just walk away. There is no reason for you to engage with someone when they're being cruel that way if you're a child. And this also applies to out in the community. These issues are not just in schools. Oftentimes in host countries, community members may say this to a child's Black friend or family members if they're out. Walk away. It's the same advice I'd give in the United States. But be there for your friend, and then say, hey, are you okay? Find a trusted adult, tell them the situation, and let them take it from there. I have suggested in schools that they have a mechanism where students and teachers and adults can report incidents anonymously. If they really feel like it's going to cause an issue, that they have an anonymous way to report. So I've been suggesting that to schools. I have not seen it implemented, but also I'm not necessarily tracking that. But that's another way to give students a way to say, hey, I saw this happen. I don't know who or how to tell. I don't want people to know who I am, but I heard or saw this happen. So you can ask schools to do that, and that's helpful for kids. Um, and at the end of the day, if you have non-Black kids who want to be allies, just be there for your friends if it happens. Maybe off, I call it offline, out of the situation, check in on them and say, hey, I know that happened yesterday. That had to be painful. Do you want to talk about it? I'm here for you, or however kids talk these days. I know they don't say that's not the language they use, but my son would be like, that's not how we talk, but however they talk, however you can be there for your friend, be there for your friend.
As an adult, I understood you, but I totally hear you.
Yeah.
That is not what my kids.
The kids would be like,
I do. So I really appreciate you saying that, because it's not a kid's job to solve the problem, but it is their job to be a good community member and to try and help others be a good community member. And if that's not how things are going, then help whomever just get off the spot, get off the X, get somewhere where it is not going to keep coming at them. And unfortunately, man, there are some bad seeds out there. You see it in adults, you see it in kids, and they are the ones to avoid. But we should try and mitigate those bad seeds and do the best that we can, right?
yeah.
How do we help our schools? I mean, you're saying an anonymous tip box, right? What else can we do in our schools to help make them safer spaces?
Um, as I sort of mentioned earlier, that a lot of the workforce identifies as white, and in American sponsored schools, most of them are American. There needs to be some training around this. There just needs to be some hard and fast, as soon as school starts, these are the things to look for. Do some personal internal work on, you may have some biases that you're not aware of. We all do. Put that out there. Some, teacher prep in the United States leans heavily towards Black students in urban areas. Those are not these kids, right? They're not low socioeconomic status. They're not in poverty. They're not in urban areas. But that's the only preparation some of these teachers have. So they instantly start to put that deficit thinking, as we call it, or inferior thinking on these kids. So maybe do some training around, what is it you actually think when you see Black students? And that also extends to other students of color, right? Like there's layers to this. Schools have to do the work. They have to do the trainings of these teachers. They also have to train the community members. Not every host country is, gonna take this up in arms and be like, yes. So how do schools keep students safe, but also respect whatever those cultural norms are, even if we don't agree? One way is to just have clear language. I understand that as a culture or as an ideology, you believe, and I'll say Black people are inferior, but when you come to campus, that kind of behavior or thinking has no place here, and we're going to have to address it. We're not telling you how to think or be, but we are a global community. We are a multicultural campus, and be very clear up front with parents in the handbook, child protection, teachers do a back to school night. Whenever you have an opportunity to communicate, make it very clear that certain behaviors are intolerable. Recognize microaggressions. I know I'm throwing a lot at you. Microaggressions are probably the biggest issue. That's the touching of the hair, or the joking of the color of your skin, or those kinds of things. Or, I bet, I think a child said to my son, are you Senegalese? Which is not an insult, but he was not. Well, of course you are, because, the color of your skin, or what country of Africa are you from? And, all these things are what we call microaggressions. Train teachers and students to recognize what they are, what their intent is, and how to stop it in their tracks. I've had so many teachers say to me, I just didn't know that's what was happening. I didn't get it. There was a Black student who was being called Jamal by all the kids in middle school, which was not this child's name. And the teacher thought they were just sort of jokingly calling him a name. But it turned out that it was a trope on the internet that was heavily racist, and all the kids knew it. It was akin to, I guess you call it a digital blackface. And the teacher just didn't know. And then we kind of dug deeper. So teachers need to have an awareness too, to be very sensitive and sort of know what to look for. And that all comes with training that the schools have to do. And I think that I'm going to get another plug. Office of Overseas Schools is willing to put money, time, and effort into some of those trainings if they know it's a problem.
Right.
And that's where there's a disconnect.
Well, so those of you who may not be aware, Office of Overseas Schools is in Washington, D.C., and they have regions. The globe is basically parcels, sectioned up into regions where they have people, education experts, overseeing each country, each coast has a school that is supported by Office of Overseas Schools. And they ensure that the school meets these particular levels. They often offer support and small grants to the school in order to meet certain needs. And they ensure that the quality of the education at the school and the safety of the kids at the school meets a particular level. And they are, if you are serving at a consulate or an embassy, your management or your CLO would be able to give you the contact info for your particular region's, I can't remember the acronym, but there is a regional education officer, I think it is.
That's it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, they're definitely out there to help, and they want to know more about these topics for sure. It's in their strategic plan for the next 5 years, so they won't be confused if you reach out. And again, I'll say that's for Black families or families that have Black children, and non-Black families also. They want to hear from everybody, and we're all sort of in this big purple blob together.
Well, I mean, I can't thank you enough, Tanisha, for bringing this to us and just talking about this. This is a very important conversation to have, not just you and I, but also, those of you who are listening. Have this conversation with your kids or with your spouse or with, the teachers of your kids. If you are friends with teachers and you don't have kids, like, this is an important topic to talk about, purely because not enough people are talking about it.
Agreed.
So I just wanted to thank you again for this very important call, or this very important topic. Talking about anti-Black cultures in the international school systems is an important conversation to have. I so appreciate you coming. Do you have any last words?
No, I too. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. It's also good to connect with you again, the small world of the small world. But yeah, definitely also reach out to me. My email is the letter B, the word beyond, and the word bias, no space, at gmail.com. Reach out to me with any questions, scenarios that I'm able to help with. Definitely connect me with your schools or CLOs or whomever. I'm also in this with you. I'm also in EFM. So definitely feel free to reach out with me for any reason. I'm super accessible, and I'm here to really help all the kiddos have the best experience in international schools that they can. Thanks again for having me.
I'll include the email in the show notes so people can easily find it. Thank you again very much for joining. Thanks for listening, everybody, and have a great day.